Hello, I'm Bookface, and I just did the most nostalgic research I've ever done because I love the Secret Saturdays. Great cartoon, all about cryptids. I didn't actually start watching it when it was initially coming out. I watched it a few years later when I realized what a cryptid was, and I'm like, wait, that's my thing! And I love it. Also, the research for this particular video was even more tiring than the previous one, because instead of having a very limited amount of resources to try to figure out what it is, I had way too many resources, and a lot of them fit in little ways, but were off in little ways, and I didn't know which to go with. So eventually I ended up with a few possible answers that all have slight issues with them, and now I end up having this nagging feeling that perhaps I'm wrong, and I'm just assuming and I'd never realize it. So yeah, that's the impending dread. So let's ask, what is the Antarctic Cryptid? So spoilers for the show, because this is for the season 2 finale. So if you want to watch this episode and haven't, maybe skip this. Granted, this is a show from 2008, so if you haven't seen it, I'd imagine it's probably not on your watch list. But if it is, don't watch this. I don't want spoilers. I will throw away my own views to not spoil this cartoon, which I think is very good. So basically, the show revolves around Kerr, which they say is this cryptid. It is not. We'll get into that later. That can control all the other cryptids. Slightly flawed premise, since definition of cryptid is just animal that isn't proven, which means it could literally just be a bear where there shouldn't be a bear, and there's nothing unique about it, it's just a bear. But anyways, so at the season 2 finale, the Saturdays are pretty sure they've found Kerr, because Fiskerton led them there. He's got this whole link to Lemuria thing. What? It's an odd plot point. So they end up going to Antarctica and find this thing. Spoiler alert, it is not actually Kerr. Whole episode goes down fighting that and the villain, and it's a wild ride. Only to find out they have this thing that determines where Kerr is, because apparently a lot of people want this quote cryptid, except they realize that it's not pointing to the big giant, it's pointing to Zach, who just unlocked some new powers, and they now realize that he is in fact Kerr. So yeah, the twist is good. It gives a very dramatic conclusion to the season, really makes you interested for the next season, but it also makes you wonder, what is this thing then? You're just showing us this giant abomination monster with all these heads, and you're like, well, it's not Kerr. Moving on. So there's a few things to get out of the way in terms of Secret Saturdays and how it builds its creatures and how we reverse engineer that. One, the Secret Saturdays is actually pretty good at getting specific details, actually having references to back up those details, including a couple very specific kinds of cryptids that were very hard for me to find, and details of cryptids that are based a lot more in technical and less widespread information. On the other hand, though, they call everything a cryptid when a lot of times they are not cryptids. Mythological creatures, folkloric entities, and one time an actual biblical demon all fall into the category of cryptid. I understand they have a theme, and I understand maybe including some things as a cryptid even when they don't entirely fall into that category. I mean, actual cryptids as well just do that, so fair enough, I guess. But for them to say Azazel, a cryptid? That's not right. That's weird. Also, there are some times where they get it weirdly wrong, and I'm still trying to figure that out. For example, in the video game Beast of the Fifth Sun, they have the Invunche. I did a video and it had the Invunche, and it's this weird deformed ghoul, is basically the description. They made it a giant slug that can move around in lava. I literally don't know how they got to this. That's a video of its own, but I don't know where to start with that. But anyways, we're going to talk about the Antarctic Cryptid, which is also apparently sometimes called Big Red. I don't know who calls it that, but according to the wiki, which I reference a lot, it is called Big Red sometimes. Some of the obvious things, we can tell this is a giant humanoid creature with a kind of simian structure. When it moves around, it kind of makes me think of more like ape-like, maybe even King Kong-esque, which makes a lot of sense. It seems to have these big scales on it and has tons, 12 mouths just covering its body. One regular mouth and then 11 extra mouths. It also has 6 no-eyed giant mouth snake worm things coming out of its body. They end up finding it in a caldera. I actually had to look up what that meant because I didn't know. It's a volcano that collapses in on itself after it erupts. I did not know that. Later on, it spits out little puffball monsters and dinosaurs, which, weird. But this likely indicates that it's associated with some other creatures. Like, it's got little smaller creatures creatures that go along with it. It also uses these dinosaurs to fly.
Boy, he's thick!
So it likely has some kind of wings, some very questionably effective wings. I'm sorry, it seemed like such an intense thing when I initially watched it, but watching it again for this video, I'm like, what? That doesn't make sense. Anyways, they also find it frozen in a huge block of ice, which means that it was likely something maybe cast away or fallen to the point that it got sealed away in ice. Or it could be some primordial creature, considering that it's old enough to be frozen completely in a block of ice. Also, since it's possibly related to Kerr, since it's definitely related story-wise, it's likely that it's something Sumerian or Mesopotamian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Akkadian. They're all in that range. So first off, we should talk about Kerr, because even though this thing is very much not Kerr, because if it was, then this would be a pretty short video. So Kerr in Sumerian myth was a giant underworld dragon that held back the primordial waters. Also, Kerr is the name for the underworld, so that's kind of cool. So with primordial waters, ice is technically water, and it is pretty old water since it's been there long enough to freeze that giant in place, so primordial waters? Maybe? The name Kerr means something like land or mountain. Yeah, I think I know where that came from. Kerr was eventually killed by the god Ninurta. Now those details can be used to find a similar creature since, well, if they thought this thing was Kerr, that means there are some similarities. So finding some other similarities in creatures, in things from Sumerian myth that were not Kerr, could maybe... If the Secret Saturday's version of Kerr is similar to this thing, then that means the real-life Kerr is probably similar to whatever it actually is. Maybe. So my first guess was Asag. So he's related with cold and ice, which is definitely relevant considering it's frozen in ice. Also, to any fans of the Magnus archives that are confused, it is not associated with fire at all. Asag also commands lesser creatures, those being these rock monster things that he bore when he boned a mountain.
What?
So, got a connection to smaller creatures as well as a connection to the mountains. A very special connection. Asag also inhabited the underworld and also held back the primordial waters. And also he was a giant dragon. You'd think I would have ordered that first in my notes, but of course not. So those are pretty spot-on comparisons with Kerr. Giant dragon holding back the waters, living in the underworld. Additionally, he also had a conflict with Ninurta, very similarly, but it's unclear whether he died or not in this confrontation. The obscurity of that could explain why they weren't expecting to find it in the ice and didn't think it was that, though it's still a little tricky. So there are a lot of interesting details connecting Asag to Kerr in a lot of thematic ways and physical descriptors. So that's a pretty good guess, but I wasn't quite satisfied with that, because of course I wasn't. So I looked into figures related to the underworld in general, since, where Kerr lived and also what Kerr shared his name with. Next I came to Nergal, who ruled the underworld. He was a war deity and also had 14 plague demons associated with him, which could explain either the backup and or the snake things coming out of the body. He ended up being bound to the underworld, which is used to explain the change of the seasons, similar to the myth of Persephone, which not only ties him to the winter and therefore the cold, but the binding of Nergal into the underworld would seem pretty similar to how the creature in the show is bound in ice. There are a lot of decent similarities here, but unfortunately I wasn't able to find any good source that gave a solid physical description of Nergal, so it would take a lot to go from what would presumably just look like a dude, because that's what most deities look like, to this thing. My next guest was Lamashtu, who absolutely had a physical description. She is depicted as a bizarre chimerical creature with lion, eagle, and donkey features, which could definitely explain the weird, bizarre features of this thing. So she was related to mothers and caused them danger, which is relevant thematically because of the whole backstory that Zach became possessed, infected, became Kerr while his mother was still pregnant with him. So essentially it would be passing on this danger to an unborn child. And this particular incident ends up causing Zach a lot more danger because everyone wants to kill him now. She also steals children and nurses them with poison, which could also maybe be related to Zach gaining powers, like feeding poison, giving power from something bad. It's a weird thing. She was often depicted holding two-headed snakes, which connects her to serpents and the whole thing of multiple heads. People would give her sacrifices of centipedes, along with other things like brooches and pins and such, but we're focused on centipedes because in the episode, Argos uses these weird cryptid centipedes to control the Antarctic Cryptid. Also, the villain's name is Argos. Did I not mention that? I guess I'm assuming that you know the Secret Saturdays. If you're watching this, this is the most frantic, I don't know what I'm talking about kind of video, even though I know this series inside and out. And of course, she was also thought to live in the underworld. Now, this one's pretty close, but there are still some details that don't really line up. Next up, we have Tiamat, who you might know because the name's a little more popular. She was a creator/mother goddess and served the common mythological role of mother of all monsters, because it's not just the Godzilla movies. She was particularly known for giving birth to 11 monsters, several of whom were serpents and dragons. And no, I do not plan on listing them because the research for this ended up taking way longer than I thought, and I'm very tired. I will point out, though, with the specific numbers, along with the regular mouth, the Antarctic Cryptid has 11 extra mouths. Could that maybe represent the multiple kids? One pair of mouths for each kid? She's got a lot of mouths to feed. She represented the ocean and its water, so surrounded by the ocean, stuck in frozen water, there's a bit of a connection there. And of course, she was also old enough, which connects her to the primordial waters and being there long enough to be frozen in those waters. In myth, she was killed and split in two, and since deities don't often die in mythology, per se, it could explain that one part of her was instead locked away in ice. Additionally, she was often identified like a sea serpent or a dragon, similar to Kerr. And while a lot of these things fit thematically, again, there's not really much physical descriptors to really explain all of this. So I'm a little frustrated at this point, and then I decide to check the Secret Saturdays wiki to see if there was any guesses there. I have been on that wiki a lot of times. The last time I checked, there was no guess there. But lo and behold, a thing below the article suggested Humbaba. Humbaba was a creature that opposed Gilgamesh in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is referenced in the show, by the way, so the creator definitely knew the Epic of Gilgamesh. And also there's a connection here because, well, Humbaba was an antagonistic force to the main character, much like the Antarctic Giant is an antagonist to Zach, the main character. Also, Gilgamesh had a wild man companion named Enkidu, and, Zach has Viskerton, building the connection of hero with wild man companion fight giant. He was a giant with a tail that had a snake head at the end, plate-like scales, as well as a beard of wild hair, which could explain the whole almost ape-like structure. And of course, the snake tail, obviously, it's a snake coming out of the body, and, well, Antarctic Cryptid has several of those, and the scales would explain the scales. Additionally, some have drawn connections in the studying of world myth between Humbaba and the Gorgon of Greek myth, which, as I'm sure you know, has snake hair, which I think kind of fully solidifies the whole snake heads coming out of the body thing. I will say, though, the reason that Humbaba and the Gorgon were connected was the fact that both of their faces were intimidating enough to be put on, like, talismans, warding things. Basically, face so scary that even just a picture of it is enough to scare things off. Still, it's a connection. And here's the thing for me, though. It was a detail I hadn't even thought about, because I just thought it was a design feature. But as soon as I read it, I realized, oh, that makes sense. Which is that Humbaba's face was described as looking like bunched up entrails. And so, when I look at the Antarctic Cryptid's wrinkled up face with the blood-red body, it makes a lot of sense. Humbaba was the guardian to a cedar forest, and was also thought to represent nature. But not just like, I'm the Lorax, I speak for the trees, more like, I am the tree. And since he sort of embodied the forest, aka an ecosystem, it would explain why he has this symbiotic thing going on with the creatures living in his body. In a way, he is the ecosystem. Just before Humbaba was killed, he pleaded for mercy, asking Enkidu to back him up, since they're both like wild man kind of figures, which makes the connection between them, much like how Viskerton has a connection with the thing enough to find it. Additionally, Humbaba was protected by 7 mystical auras, according to what I read, which could either relate to the 6, or maybe 7, I didn't get a perfect count, and I also got the number from the wiki, so I take it with a grain of salt, serpents that come out of the body, or it could relate to how it unlocked the powers of Kerr in Zach, surrounding him this incredibly powerful mystic aura. Humbaba's roar was thought to bring storms, and he was thought to be able to breathe fire and death. And this thing, it really roared. They got creative with the roaring sounds. In conclusion, there are several creatures in Sumerian myth that have a lot of similarities with this. And in fact, I cut over half of my guesses because initially I had so many with some possibilities of being connected, but I narrowed it down to the ones that had the most details that were shared with the Antarctic Cryptid. In the end, though, Humbaba shares an overwhelming amount of very specific great details. So I'd say most definitely this creature, at the very least, was a huge inspiration for the monster. Ultimately, he could have made this up. Like, it's entirely possible. But the similarities are pretty strong. And in the end, sometimes the best source is other people with similar interests. I spent so much time on the Secret Saturdays wiki, so it's honestly silly that I didn't check that first. Also, when I did see that guess on the wiki, I got this sheepish look on my face, and I'll admit I felt a little sad I wasn't the one to come to the conclusion on my own. But at that point, my options were either lose hours of research due to pride in the fact that I didn't get it myself, or do as much research into Humbaba as physically possible, testing my sanity, to justify my contribution to this guess. And there was also the unspoken third option of not mentioning the wiki and treating it as my discovery, but I'm not a scumbag, so that really wasn't an option. Ultimately, conclusion... I've been talking for so long my throat hurts, and so does my brain. In conclusion, Antarctic Cryptid equals Humbaba. I'm kinda dumb, and I really spin my wheels a lot without getting anywhere. And the people behind the Secret Saturdays wiki are pretty smart. If you like this video, please leave a thumbs up, comment down below, and subscribe. If you like this series, maybe check out my last one that I did on the most recent Predator movie, Prey, or maybe suggest something that I could do for another one. And I will see you next time. Bye!